everyone, welcome back to the Frugal Kitchen. Today we are making a vegan copycat Cheez-It recipe that is very delicious. This recipe comes from Eat Figs Not Pigs, which is a very funny URL, I will say. It's a food blog, I'm assuming all vegan, and it starts off with vegan Parmesan cheese, or I'm starting off with that because I don't have any prepackaged vegan Parmesan cheese. And I found a recipe for the Parmesan cheese at minimalistbaker.com. I had to reduce their recipe by, I'm going to say, a third or so. I did not measure the cashews. I need 2 tablespoons of vegan Parmesan for this recipe. So I tried to eyeball 2 tablespoons of cashews. I think I got more than I need. If you look in my hands, you probably need maybe half or a third of this amount. And I like this recipe because it doesn't have that many ingredients. And I don't really like making Parmesan because it always involves cashews, which is fine, except the cashews are really freaking expensive. So this recipe uses only 2 tablespoons of vegan Parmesan, so I thought it was a lot more affordable. So I'm going to throw into the food processor a handful-ish of cashews, a tablespoon of nutritional yeast, and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Next, we're going to be doing garlic powder to taste. The original recipe, which I'm not sure how much it yields, it says 16 tablespoons here, is 3/4 cup of cashews, 3 tablespoons of nutritional yeast, 3/4 teaspoon of sea salt, and a 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder. I didn't need that much, and I didn't know what else I was going to do with all that vegan Parmesan, so I just did this small recipe. Grind that up as finely as you can, so it should end up looking kind of like that. And then I decided to scoop it out using my tablespoon to see if I'd gotten enough. And I think I ended up having 2.5 tablespoons of the Parmesan, so you don't need quite as many cashews as I used. It would have been good to measure this, honestly, but I was like, how am I going to measure cashews? They don't really fit into a measuring spoon. I'd have to crush them up. I thought if I'd only thought about that sooner, guys. I'm doing a little taste test here to see how close to Parmesan it actually tastes, and it was surprisingly very good. Now we're going back to the eatfigsnotpigs.com recipe, and we need 6 ounces of vegan cheese, so I'm going to weigh this out. That bag is about 7 ounces. I really don't like weighing stuff. I should have measured in cups for you what this was, but so the internet tells me regular shredded cheese from the cow is about 1 3/4 cups for a package of 7 ounces. So I think this is a little bit lighter though, but I don't think it's 2 cups. So anyway, if you know the answer, please tell us in the comments. How many cups is in a bag or even 6 ounces of vegan cheese? I think they all kind of weigh the same amount. So once your cheese is weighed out, go ahead and put that plus the Parmesan into the food processor, and the recipe says to chop it up enough so that it looks like it's shredded, and I was like, oh, well, it's already started out shredded, so it looks kind of like interesting little granules at this point. Next, we're going to be using 1 tablespoon of nutritional yeast. And if you don't know, the reason we use nutritional yeast so much in this recipe is because it tastes kind of like cheese, but not enough like cheese. Like the vegan cheese that comes in a package tastes a lot more like cheese than nutritional yeast does. but there is a hint of cheese in there. And then 1 teaspoon of salt, and that should be a half a teaspoon of paprika. I misread, but that's okay because it didn't actually change the recipe for the worse. And then a teaspoon of garlic powder. I should add at this point that my husband found them a little bit too salty when he tried them, so you may want to lower the salt content if you have an issue with overly salty foods. I found it tasted correct, like accurate. It tasted like the actual real Cheez-Its, which are quite salty. And then we're going to be adding a 1/4 teaspoon of turmeric. If you don't have turmeric, don't worry about it. It only adds color. It does not really add any flavor. Stir that all up. And then we'll be adding 4 tablespoons of vegan margarine. The recipe literally says 4 tablespoons of room temperature butter. And I was like, did this person forget they're writing a vegan recipe? So apparently they did. Or their word for butter is something else. It's not stuff from a cow's udders. And my butter was not room temperature. I don't know if you've watched me bake in the past, but I literally never remember to let my butter soften. So I used my hands and the heat from my hands to kind of melt the butter and smush it into the dough. And it turned out okay. Don't judge. Now we're going to add 1 cup of flour. I should have tried chickpea flour, but I wanted to be as close to this recipe as I could for the first time. Chickpea flour, I think, would be a very wonderful gluten-free substitute because I have seen chickpeas used in other cheese, quote-unquote, dips. So the recipe also calls for ice cold water, 2 to 4 tablespoons. I don't know what the temperature has to do with it, so I used the water from my water bottle, which had recently been refilled from the refrigerator. So that was cold, but I don't think it does anything. Like, I'm not sure what it's supposed to do. So I started out with 2 tablespoons and then stir to see if that is moist enough, dry enough, if it's the right consistency. It should definitely stick together. There shouldn't be any crumbly bits, but it should not be so wet that you can see like water slicked up on the dough itself, if that makes any sense. So as you can see, the dough is still quite crumbly, so I ended up adding 2 more tablespoons of water plus whatever fell out of the bottle when I was trying to make a tablespoon. So the reason I wanted to make this Cheez-It recipe was because I found another recipe, and I don't remember where, well, Pinterest, but I don't remember whose recipe. And it was for Cheez-Its, but it was almost identical to this recipe, except that there was no vegan cheese in it. There was a lot of nutritional yeast instead. And I thought it tasted like, pretty good crackers, but definitely not Cheez-It crackers. So I scoured the internet, by that I mean Pinterest, and looked for one that specifically had vegan cheese in it because I think vegan cheese tastes pretty close to regular cow's cheese. And I thought that having that in the recipe would definitely elevate it over the one that I had found previously that didn't include the cheese. And one thing I like about this is that you can kind of flavor it any way you want. You could get shredded mozzarella. I know they make white cheddar Cheez-Its, although I don't know if there's any white cheddar vegan cheese out there. So now you're supposed to let the dough refrigerate for 45 minutes, an ungodly amount of time. I cannot be patient that long. The recipe does say to split it in 2 sections and then cover them up with plastic, and I thought, who cares about all that? That's a waste of plastic, which we don't even have that kind of plastic in the house anymore. I didn't understand the point of that, so I just split it in half after it was in the refrigerator. Turned out fine. And then I'm sorry, I had to cut out all the scenes of me rolling this because you mostly saw my shoulder, and how is that helpful? So roll it out with a rolling pin, press it between two sheets of parchment paper if that's your preference. You could also put some flour on the counter. And then you're going to want to take something like this bench scraper and make little bitty 1-inch squares approximately. Don't kill yourself over the size of these, it does not matter. If you're liking the video so far, please like, share, and subscribe. I do have more interesting recipes coming up soon. And the original recipe writer also adds that if you want to be extra, you can put a toothpick hole in every single square in the center because, as you might remember, Cheez-Its have those cute little holes in the middle. But I didn't do that because that took extra time. And here is my second half of the dough. And the only point in splitting the dough in half, at this point at least, is that it's easier to roll it between parchment paper when it's smaller. You do want to try to roll it to be, I think the recipe said a 1/4 inch thick, but that's kind of thick for crackers. So try to get it a little bit closer to 1/8 of an inch, although I know that's very small and very hard to do. I don't think I've ever gotten it that small. One thing I did when rolling the second batch of dough, since I didn't want to waste another piece of parchment paper, was I just threw a little bit of flour on the counter and rolled it on top of that. And then I tried to rub the flour off, but it didn't rub off that great, as you might be able to see. But that did not really change the flavor of the crackers at all. Okay, now we're going to bake the crackers at 350 degrees for 15 minutes. Then you're supposed to lower the temperature of the oven to 275. Here's what they look like after the first 15 minutes. And then bake them for 10 to 15 minutes at 275. So I'm doing 13 minutes is sort of between those two times. So at this point, the edges are supposed to be golden brown, but it looks like they have not really cooked since the first run in the oven. They're still kind of soft. So I'm going to throw them in for 3 more minutes and see what happens. So they're supposed to be finished with the oven, and the recipe says to let them cool for about 15 minutes. So I set the timer for that long, and then I tried to taste test them, and they were still pretty soft, like almost cookie-like, not cracker-like at all. And I am of the impression now that you shouldn't bother lowering the temperature in the oven. I think maybe you should keep it at 350, turn the trays halfway after 15 minutes and let them go another 15 or 10 minutes and see what happens, and just keep an eye on them. So basically what I did was I turned off the oven. I left them in the oven for quite a while we watched a movie, maybe 20 or 30 minutes. And then I took them out and I said, well, I guess they're good. And then I tasted them and they were good at this point. But some of the crackers fell inside the oven, like inside the drawer underneath the oven. So there's me throwing crackers onto the tray. And I didn't do a taste test at this point because I had been cooking them for too long. But I will say that after they cooled and I was finished cooking and no longer frustrated with the cooking time and the bad instructions on that, I thought they were really good. They taste like cheese. They taste like Cheez-Its, and they were quite delicious. So I would love to make these again, maybe with a different cheese flavor. I also really love the Tabasco Cheez-Its because I'm from Louisiana, down where Tabasco is made. So I totally would think about maybe adding that instead of water as an option. I hope you really like this recipe. Happy eating!